So we'll just take a look at this model, and I made just a real kind of quick and dirty HEC RAS model. The hillshade imagery that we see right here is based on LiDAR data for the county. And let me just kind of back up for a minute. When you open HEC RAS, you get this window. This graphical user interface has not been updated in probably over 30 years, and it's going strong. So there's a lot of different things happening here. I went and said file open project, and I found this .prj file. There's a lot of files associated with that. So you can see for the project, it's got the PRJ file, and that kind of stores all the high level information. What are the components of the project? There is a plan, and the plan refers to the kinds of flow conditions. What are the discharges that we're putting into it? What are the boundary conditions? The geometry, of course, is the series of cross sections and elevations. And so that's a separate file. And then there's finally a steady flow file, and that, I guess that more specifically has the boundary conditions. The plan is what kind of model run are we going to do? Are we going to do a steady flow run, an unsteady flow run? Kind of more of the high level parameters, and then this is the actual input and boundary conditions. Let's see here. So these are all files that have been created as you go, and you'll create them for your projects for the Critical Creek example. So I clicked on this little stick figure here to open up the geometry. And this is really just imagery. This thing right here is just to kind of show, it's just a graphic. It doesn't have a lot of meaning to it. And I guess I can show you real quick. There is a kind of a relatively new feature in the last 5 years or so. And it's basically a very simple GIS that HEC RAS has developed. It's called RAS Mapper. You access it by clicking on this little map right here. And RAS Mapper allows you to import a digital elevation model. So what you see is a hillshade image. Underneath that is a digital elevation model that has for every grid cell an elevation value. And you can actually build your model in RAS Mapper. So what I did is very quickly, as you can see, it's pretty rough. I drew the center line kind of through the valley. And then I drew cross sections, try to be perpendicular across the valley, from valley wall to valley wall. Those are the basic pieces of information that you need. And then RAS Mapper will interpolate underneath these cross sections to get an actual cross section. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So it samples the LiDAR data for that. And then you can export this back into HEC RAS and as a geometry like this. So you can see all the cross sections here. There's station numbers. And so it starts at 0 down here, and then it traces along that line and assigns station elevation numbers upstream. So this is in feet. All right, so in the, it's the program of 1,000 windows. In the geometry editor, it's a lot to do. Let's look at cross sections. You could input these manually. For example, you go out and just survey a cross section. And if you knew the elevations, you could just copy and paste them here, station elevation. And as long as you know the elevations and then you know the downstream distance to the next cross section, that's all RAS needs to know. It'll calculate the slope for you, right, between the cross sections based on elevation. I've run the model already, so it's got different flow profiles, and it's plotting the energy grade line, the water surface profile, and the critical flow depth for 3 different discharges. So that's what all this information is here. Here's the lowest flow, second lowest, and then third. You can also assign Manning's roughness values. Most simply, you can say, okay, I'm gonna set my bank stations, and those are red dots that are, there's one right there, and there's one right here. And those red dots just say, okay, my channel is within these dots, and then my overbank area is outside of those dots. So we can assign a roughness for the channel, which is typically smaller, and you could assign a bigger roughness for the overland areas. I didn't do that here, but if the channel is 0.045, then maybe a floodplain with a bunch of sage grass and cactus and whatever that else is over there might be somewhere around 0.08 or something like that. So I can actually adjust that. You can actually get more complicated and just assign multiple different Manning's N values at different stations, and that's an option in here. Anyway, we don't need to get into that now, but it is an option that's available. There we go. Horizontal variation in N values. And so in this case, you can just say, okay, 0.8 starts here, 0.045 starts here, but say there's like a patch of cottonwoods. I want to say, okay, actually it should be 0.08. I'm going to bump it up to 0.1 right here for that cottonwood patch along the river, right? And you can use a GIS to actually measure all that stuff. And RAS Mapper can actually do all that too. So the cross section is really the meat and potatoes of the 1D HEC RAS model. And I cut these manually, or kind of, I don't know, I drew them and then sampled them from the digital elevation model. But of course, you could go out with a survey and do that yourself. So we'll do the critical creek thing together, but and kind of learn more about the steps. But I just wanted to show you what some output can look like. And here's the whole model. I put in a certain discharge value associated with a frequency. So we'll say the 10-year flood or the 100-year flood, something like that. And what it did is it estimated an elevation or calculated an elevation for that flow at a particular cross section. And then it did it at this cross section. And what RAS Mapper did is it interpolated those elevations from here to here. And then using the DEM underneath this, the topography, it calculated the flow depth. And so I get a continuous, and it looks like a two-dimensional kind of model output, right? But really it's a one-dimensional exercise. So now I get a map, and I could export this, and you'll do this in hydrology, as a KMZ file or a shape file, or and actually produce a map based on this. So here I have flow depth. I could do velocity. Velocity, I wouldn't really trust the outputs on velocity because you get one average velocity at a cross section, and it's doing some funky interpolation schemes. So I'm not gonna. This is not like physically based or physics based. If you do a 2D model, it would be, and then you get water surface elevation. And this is important because that's what you can say, okay, I'm gonna build some development. And of course, you might have noticed if you've been out there, but I think right here, they went in and filled this area in for a cul-de-sac. And actually encroached into the floodplain. So I don't know if the 500-year flood gets out there or what, but if you were to do that and you're interested in how much that's going to raise a certain flood elevation, then it'd be important to know the elevation of the floodplain here. So that's just a little brief introduction. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, not in the park. The park, this is upstream. There's a split here, and I'm trying to remember, this is Echo Canyon. And then this would be the main wash. So actually, we can't see Devil's Kitchen. This is where you come in. The guard station is, I can't remember how the roads go, but, oh yeah, so this is, yeah, so here. Yeah. So this would be the trail over to Echo Canyon on the Slick Rock, and then back up Old Gorman's Trail. Yeah. Yeah. So all downstream of the monument. All right. So let's, if you've got HEC RAS open, if you don't, please feel free to go on one of these computers. It looks like everyone's, except for, there we go. So go ahead and open RAS, and then if you download that zip file on the assignment. So I have this under labs. If you download this example file, it's a zip file, so just extract it into a new folder, and then you can just go ahead and open it up. So we'll do that. I'm gonna close this down. Yeah, so he went into RAS Mapper. He got that digital elevation model of Mars, or that portion of Mars. He did a 2D model, so he made a grid as opposed to cross sections. So cross sections is 1D, grid is 2D, and then he said, okay, we're gonna put he probably drew a line at some part of the model and said, we're gonna put this hydrograph in there. And so that's where all the flow, you could just think of it as a huge pipe, and all the flow goes into the model at that point, and then it propagates across the craters. 2D modeling is fun. It's definitely a lot more work. It's harder to calibrate 2D models, but it's becoming a very common hydraulic engineering tool for a lot of river designs. I think a lot of folks expect a 2D model when you're doing kind of big river type of work. Culvert stuff, stormwater stuff, no, but I was on a proposal for a water diversion upgrade on the Yampa, and they wanted a 3D model, and it's like, whoa, calm down here. But you can evaluate a lot more, like, okay, where are the different flow paths that fish could migrate up this thing, and how you get a lot more detail, especially velocity and depth distributions. So if you go to Open Project and navigate to the Critical Creek project, that'll open it up. And raise your hand if you're not there yet. Okay, let's get in there. Okay. I'm going to open the applications guide, and this is what we're going to follow. So I went to Help, Application Guide. If it doesn't pull up for some reason, you can always go to the website and just search HEC RAS Application Guide, and it should pull up for you. Let's see here. Let's do File, Open Project. So you have to click on the actual project file. So if you go to the folder where it is and then click on it under the title screen, make it blue and then press OK. So under the applications guide, if you go to Help, Applications Guide, and then you can just search for Chapter 1 or Critical Creek. And I'm not going to go through this whole tutorial. We can spend as much time as we want in class right now doing this together, and I can kind of walk around and troubleshoot. But I just want to introduce a few things. And I'll wait just for our friends everyone to be here. But we do have, so we have the project file, we have the plan, it says existing conditions. And let's see here. We have a geometry file and we have a steady flow input file. These are the main components of the model. And we're going to do what's called subcritical flow analysis. And then I think we'll look at different kinds of flow regimes. So we can tell the model that it's a subcritical flow, and it'll tell you if that's true or not, right? And the reason we do that is because we kind of have to choose that up front because it's based on the boundary conditions. If we don't expect our stream to go critical or subcritical, sorry, supercritical during a flood event, then we can kind of force it to do that, and it's going to do a certain kind of calculation based on that. The minimum flow depth in this case will be the critical flow depth. So it'll allow it to go down to critical flow, but not below it. And so that's important because it's really easy for flow to go to supercritical. Steep kind of headwater type streams, if you put enough flow in them, the model is going to assume that it's supercritical because of the steepness and the discharge. In real world conditions, the model will say it's supercritical, but we know about kind of natural streams that we talked about earlier that, you know, you go around bends, you go up and down, you go over riffles, over boulders. It's really hard to maintain supercritical flow. You're going to get a hydraulic jump, and the flow might go back and forth between supercritical and subcritical under a flood type of condition if the channel's steep enough. So if we model for supercritical, then the flow depth is going to be less than what it might be in reality. And so that's why we might want to force our model to stay at a minimum the critical flow depth. And that's important because we need to know the water surface elevation for a certain flood event so that we can figure out, you know, where the water is going to be, how high or how far back we want to move certain development and the like. And Carrie ran into this issue. She was working on a project as a uranium mine. I think they wanted to either reopen it or reclaim it. I can't remember. It was out in Utah. And she did the hydrology, she did the hydraulics, and they had this channel. They wanted to kind of route the surface water around the pit of the mine, right? And it was around this kind of steep slope. And the model was saying it's going to be supercritical because it's really steep. But, you know, we kind of went back and forth on it and decided to just say that at a minimum it would be critical flow depth because they wanted to know how big they needed to make these berms to keep the water from going into the mine, something like that. So in real world conditions, it's really hard to maintain supercritical flow. Okay, so I'm going to move on and we'll look at the geometry. So pretty simple stream here. We've got 12 cross sections. There's no visual underneath here. It's not necessary. And you got a flow path. This arrow shows you where the flow is going. It's important to remember that. So I did this little stick figure here. Okay. And that'll open this geometry window up. And we can look at a couple things. We can look at the cross sections. Model's already been run, so it has the information from the model run in it. And there's one flow rate, the 100-year flood. You get the water surface elevation in blue, the critical flow depth, and the energy grade line. And so as you can see, we're above the critical flow depth, so this is subcritical. And then I can use these arrows right here to look at all the cross sections. So I'm on cross section 12, go down, look at 11. There's some kind of levee or berm there. And then I can keep going down. One thing to note that in HEC RAS, unless you designate some high feature as a berm or a levee, and you can do that under options, levees, and then you tell it the station and elevation, then HEC RAS will assume that the flow can go around it. And so it'll treat this whole area as a conveyance area. And that's because you could imagine that there's like an island or some kind of high point that is not contiguous up and downstream. But if it is, and you need to treat it that way, like a levee would be, then you can actually designate these features as a levee, and it would just keep all the flow in the main channel over here. And of course, the flow would be higher in this particular situation. So I was in geometry, and then I clicked on cross sections. I think you can also double click on a cross section. No. So you can, obviously you can edit and look at your cross sections here. You can add bridges and culverts. So what HY8 does, you can actually do in HEC RAS. HEC RAS is a little more complicated. And so, unless you need to model the whole river system, like Dylan, we were talking about earlier, what happens if the flow finds a low point around the culvert? So say the road kind of comes up to where the culvert is right here, and then there's some low point. What if the flow goes around that? Because during the 100-year flood, it's just really big and it could do that. Well, you could model that in HEC RAS. You could actually model the whole river system and then put the culverts in there, or a bridge or whatever. And so for bridges, we saw some examples in that video, that practical engineering video, where you can design the bridge, the piers, the decks, the low chord, the high chord, and then put a flood in it, and it'll actually do a special kind of energy loss calculation of flow through that bridge. And it's kind of like the culvert energy loss analysis, but a little bit different. And then you can determine if your bridge is going to overtop or not, right? You can also do scour analysis based on the sediment. There's all kinds of stuff. For junctions, you can bring in tributaries. It's a little complicated, but you can do that as well. All right, let's look at steady flow data. So this Q, and it's a flat kind of horizontal water surface. Steady flow, so just one discharge, constant discharge, propagates throughout the whole model. So I'm going to click on that. And what we have here is two flows. And so what they did is that you start off with kind of an upstream cross section, in this case, river station 12, so that upstream-most cross section. And they said, okay, let's put in 9,000 CFS for the 100-year flood. You could actually model multiple floods. So if you say, enter the number of profiles, we can do up to 32,000. Say I want to do 2. I press enter, and then I can do 9,000, and I could do, say, some smaller flood that was, say, 2,000 CFS, something like that. And then I can add a flow change location. This would be where a tributary could come in. So they say a tributary comes in at river station 8, where that cross section is, and then they increase the flow rate by 500. So there you could have 2 watershed models, hydrology models, and you could say the peak flow rate from this one's going to be 500, the peak flow rate from this one's going to be 9,000. And I'm going to assume worst case scenario where the 2 peaks coincide perfectly, which doesn't often happen, but it could. So here we have multiple different flows coming from upstream, and then we have tributaries coming in. So that's the flow. That's kind of like you hook the pipe up to the model. That's going to be the, and I'm sorry, I can't make this text any bigger. Let me see. So RAS is really small. And then we need to specify the boundary conditions. So one of the boundary conditions is what's the flow rate, how much we're going to hook the hose up to the model and dump a bunch of water in it. We need to specify some other things. So that's the flow rate. The reached boundary condition right here says, okay, for all profiles, I'm going to say that for the downstream boundary condition, we're going to assume normal depth. And here's the slope. So I click on normal depth, I put in a slope. What does that mean? What do you think that means? So say the normal depth is my downstream boundary condition. Yeah, well, yeah, there's no backwater, right? That's an important one. That's, how do I calculate the elevation of the water, assuming normal depth? Yeah, so it's just a very simple, take the cross section, just like you guys did in the homework, you had a trapezoidal cross section, and you calculate the flow depth, the normal depth. not backwatered, and it's not going into some river that could be, elevated, or some ocean that changes elevation with tide. All those things will influence whether or not you have a backwater or not, right? So it's a very simple assumption. It's easy to make. You just calculate the slope of the river downstream of that area and say, okay, it's normal depth. If you think that you might have a backwater, then you would go to a known water surface elevation. And for this flow rate, you say, okay, this is what the elevation should be. And that might be something from a culvert backwater, an HY8 model or something like that. You can say it's critical depth, it's going off a waterfall or a weir. You could also put a rating curve in, which says for a given flow rate, here's the elevation of the water. And that might be something that you already have from like a USGS stream gauge or something like that. So we put it downstream because we're assuming subcritical flow. But if we think it might be supercritical, then you need to put an upstream condition, right? Because the upstream is the control for supercritical and downstream is control for subcritical. And it's all the same. If it's upstream, you could do normal depth, critical depth, etc. Last thing I'm going to talk about is this. So you can see this little person running on a flat surface. That's a steady flow simulation. We didn't define steady versus unsteady. Unsteady is a hydrograph. The water comes up, it goes down. It's a time series. So you give it a time series of flow, and it propagates that using a much more sophisticated algorithm and numerical solution for what's called the St. Venant's equation, and it routes that hydrograph through. So you get an input and an output, right? Steady flow, it's just we turn the hose on and it's steady, and we don't assume that there's a hydrograph moving through. The water's just there. So click on that little person, and I pick my geometry file, I pick my steady flow file, and then I say, okay, I think it's going to be subcritical. I could say it's supercritical or mixed. It could go actually back and forth. And if I wanted to do floodplain mapping and create that map like I did, like I showed you earlier, I would do that. So it actually performs it pretty quickly. And then if I click on this profile right here, you see this little bridge and then there's a slope going through it. I can look at my longitudinal profile. This is kind of your first diagnostic. And what it's showing me is my critical flow depth in the red, my water surface elevation in blue, and then my energy grade line in green. And you can see that the flow actually goes down to the critical flow depth in a number of locations. And this is where we have a little steeper slope, and maybe the cross section pinches it a little bit more or something like that. And it's, it might be a little concern. We might want to go back and look and say, is my model geometry reasonable there? Do I need some more cross sections? What's going on here? Is this reasonable? And it might be reasonable, yeah. It depends on what you are trying to use the model for. So if you want to be really conservative and look for the highest elevation of water possible, keep it subcritical because it won't let it fall below critical. If you want to understand actual velocity that could happen here for some kind of scour calculation, and you think it might go supercritical, then run it under mixed or super and then allow it to drop below and really accelerate and speed up in that particular cross section, and that would give you more realistic velocity potentially. So it really depends on the critical information you need from the model. This gives you the highest potential flow depth, but also tells you that maybe you need some more cross sections here because this is a big jump. Is it really this steep, or is it, you know, how does that slope look?
I might have missed something, but it says that there's an errors when I tried to get this RS equals 8 and then define flow value.
Oh, did you add the, let's see here. Did you do that? We could just do this. 2500. You know, I didn't actually apply this, so that might be what happens. Every time you make a change, it's in red. And if you hit apply, save, that sort of thing, then I'm going to go back to steady, and that might be why it yelled at you, because you actually saved that information. There we go. Apparently, I didn't run it either. This is what you should see for a successful run. It'll give you this. It might say there's warnings. That's okay. I'm going to stop there and then kind of go around. I'm asking you all to do this tutorial. So Critical Creek, and it goes for maybe 10 pages, something like that. Take some screenshots along the way. And let's take a look here. So I've got this document that kind of gives you the prompts that I would like you to follow after you run the model. And it'll have you run the model and then kind of do some refinements of the model and then rerun it. So for this, and here's kind of the little write-up I'm looking for: introduction, document the tutorial, give some screenshots, some captions. You don't have to do all 25 steps or whatever, right? Just the major outputs that are important to show along the way, and then provide a discussion at the end, responding to some of these questions right here. And there's also some questions in italics to look at as you go through. So if you want to look at the errors, go to View under the main window, and then Summary, Error, Warning, Notes. And it's got a bunch of just kind of canned warnings. I think red is like, hey, check this out. Red is, or sorry, yellow is check this out. Red is something's really bad. Yeah, I suppose they were like smaller, steeper streams. RAS was originally built to model the Mississippi River, and dredging programs and stuff like that. And the Mississippi, loses a foot every 10 miles or something like that. It's really low gradient and subcritical flow conditions. So you're gonna get a lot more warnings for smaller streams because RAS was just, it works for smaller streams, it just wasn't built for it.